So one main barrier to educational change, I feel, is educational change itself. And by this, I mean something akin to what John Dewey was talking about in 1938, when he addressed the pitfalls in educational change that were taking place in the United States. There'll be a quiz later, so you can tell me all who these characters are. Dewey recognized that making a conceptual split between progressive education on one hand and traditional education on the other is false and simplistic. And this early problematic formulation of educational change is still heard today in our industrial versus 21st century debates. So it's useful to see where education has come from, for sure, but I argue that if we linger in this dichotomy, we're going to look in the wrong places and will make less than informed choices. So in contrast, it's worth seeing that there are both excellent practices and very poor practices, both historically and in contemporary education, and we can't hide behind a simplistic dichotomy. In this big idea, I concur with Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate economist, who recently cautioned that the inability of economists to predict the U.S. economic crash was because they had been looking in the wrong place, or worse still, not really looking at all. That's Stiglitz up in the top there, in case you don't know what he looks like. Economists, he said, were being trained to look away from larger trends, and they weren't asking the right questions, and we all know the disastrous ends to which they were wrong. And I also concur with Virginia Woolf, you can tell who she is, who maintained a steady gaze on progressive education, and just as she argued for women's place in society in the 1920s, I argued that schools must continue to become a place of full human potential for all young people. So there are at least three ways in which we're wrong looking at the moment. There are probably lots, but I'm just going to talk about three. First, we continue to make faulty assumptions about kids in schools without investigating them. And I think part of what we're doing here is taking that leap. Second, while there is more and more better evidence being generated and promising practices, we need to stand back from that evidence and ask ourselves what it means. We're encountering a growing minutia of what I feel is undigested evidence, and it's even hard to get that evidence into the hands of decision makers and policymakers. And sometimes the evidence obscures the indicators of real troubles in the lives of kids, to which schools must meaningfully respond. And third, to do this meaningfully, we need to draw from a range of wisdom about kids, schools, and societies. We need to ask other people to look in other places. We need to work much more with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit scholars and elders, and our colleagues in the humanities of all things, philosophers, artists, musicians, historians. I feel that that will fortify the debate. And when we do look in the right places and with the proper tools, unlike this poor fellow here who's getting it wrong, we see a bigger picture. And we must contend here with the pervasive data that shows that socioeconomic inequality leads to poor educational outcomes and ill health for young people. Full stop. And we know that social inequality is on the rise. So here we encounter, when we look, the lamentable fact that public schools have, then and now, played their part in promising better lives, but also contributing to inequity. Schools work best for the most privileged, and we struggle now with ways to mediate social inequity in schools. Our young people and families are up against a rapidly changing society, which we all know about, and I'm trained as a sociologist, so I can't help but do this work. Global indicators suggest that this is actually pushing more kids to the margins. And public education, therefore, must examine its role in attending to the complex impacts of technology and social inequality on young lives. We see distancing of social relationships and rises in mental health challenges for our kids. And so I ask, Does our 21st century skills debate address these kinds of problems? I've had the good fortune to speak with thousands of Canadian young people over my career in research so far, and educators and parents. And this image portrays just one reflective example, really, and this is from one of the young women who was a part of a study I did on marginalization. It's just one reflective example of the way in which these thousands of Canadians articulate these bigger pictures to me. I'm not dreaming this up on my own. These kids, parents, teachers, and scholars hold a clear gaze on a number of indicators, and they ask us to do the same and take it very seriously. For example, spiking levels of anxiety and depression, dips in human empathy, climbing rates of youth unemployment, a skills gap, schooling that continues to fail Indigenous youth and communities, alarming new forms of youth violence to each other at school and online, youth suicides, disconnection and distraction from living on too many screens, feeling sold out, feeling alone. And I'll never forget a number of educators that I spoke with in a study some time ago summed it up as, we need help dealing with these lives of quiet desperation. And that has always stuck out. So I invite you to take a moment and imagine that you live in a society that is beginning to neglect and marginalize the youngest members of our human species. What would schools in such a society look like? Debates about the content, pedagogy, and structure of education have been with us long before the industrial era. In 380 BCE, for example, Plato's Socratic dialogue of the allegory of the cave, which is pictured here in a Dutch engraving from 1604, reminds us then and now of the need for love, compassion, intelligence, and civility in education. True education, then and now, is a sacred act to free young prisoners through knowledge and wisdom, so they may see and escape the caves that we have built for them. Those who address the lives and times of young people today continue to ask big questions and look for these kernels of true and lasting education. And luckily, we do see many signs of this. So they break down barriers to educational change by first looking beyond tinkering with fads. They maintain a gaze on schools' past and present forms of marginalizing kids. They look for the broadest ways to measure the successes of our kids and schools. And they keep their attention fixed on the need for high expectations for intellectual cultivation and learning. And you can all think of examples of phenomenal things that are going on in Canada in this regard, thankfully. So in closing, I would just like to thank the Canadian Education Association for taking this leap and making this space for us to try to examine the barriers and solutions in a conversation that we knew wouldn't necessarily be easy. I'm convinced that our work here is crucial to the well-being of the 10 million young people who live in Canada today, and if we get it right, maybe they will lead our next prosperous civil society. Thank you.